Hi, I'm Jackson. I'm here to talk about 10 vocab words from the Human Geography Unit, Political Organization of Space. Let's begin with geopolitics. Geopolitics is the study of how geography affects the political interactions of different states from around the world. We see that there's established patterns in different parts of the world. As in, Europe tends to be xenophobic, but it gets involved in international affairs, while Asia tends to be isolationist. We also see how resource-rich nations such as the US and Russia tend to act in self-interest, while resource-poor nations tend to be more diplomatic so that they can survive on the international stage. Geopolitics plays a huge part in international organizations. What is an international organization? An international organization is one that is made up of multiple states from around the world or from around a region. The most well-known international organization is the United Nations, which is made up of 193 member states. The United Nations has a bunch of different parts and organizations within it, such as UNICEF, its immigration committees, the Security Council, and the United Nations Parliament or Assembly. Its goal is to create international peace and to find a diplomatic solution to conflict. So, do international organizations equal peace? There's good arguments both for and against it. The four debaters or four supporters that see international organizations as good say that they help to bring a diplomatic arena to talk conflicts out rather than using war. Those who are against international organizations say that powerful nations and a balance of power, which have created the international peace that we've seen in the past century since the end of World War II. So, are internationals good or are they bad? Well, again, international organizations give smaller and weaker nations a voice. This allows resource-poor nations a place to speak, a place to get their views and their needs heard, while resource-rich nations are there to help if they want to. But some can be bad. We've seen a lot of allegations that the United Nations hasn't been too helpful, especially in Africa, where they have committed war crimes or different crimes that have created a taint on their reputation. And there are two different types of international organizations. The first is a treaty organization, which we see in the UN and NAFTA and the European Union. And then we have cartels, which are economic international organizations such as OPEC, where they don't have a central agreement, rather a handshake that says they'll work together. So I spoke about the European Union. The European Union is an international organization based in Europe. It has 28 member states. It's an economic co-op zone, which means that they work together to help their economies as well as help nations in the region that don't have help, that are part of the EU. We see this in 2009 in the Euro crisis, where the richer northern states helped the collapsing southern states such as Greece, Italy, and Spain. The European Union a global power? No, they don't act in self-interest. They don't really intervene in international affairs. A few times we've seen where they have put down sanctions, such as in Iran and on Argentina, when one nation or multiple nations have a problem with another state. And they tend to be xenophobic. We've seen in this year and the past year where some states have been slow to react to the immigrant crisis from Syria, while others have been more cooperative. But as the time has gone on, we've seen more radical right-winged ideas prevailing with xenophobic ideas to push immigrants out or just not accept immigrants. We see this in Hungary, where they've built a wall to keep immigrants out. What is an immigrant state? An immigrant state is a nation or state that accepts immigrants constantly or yearly or annually. And major ones are the European Union, where they take a lot of African and Middle Eastern immigrants into their different nations. They have migrant workers that come for a few years, do the undesirable jobs that European citizens don't want to do, And they do that, they get money, they get jobs, they get security that can bring back to their families and hopefully come back. The United States is a major immigrant state where they're taking a lot of Central American immigrants in, both illegally and legally. We take a lot of immigrants from Asia and from the Middle East as well. And this has a big part. We see a lot of conflicting political ideas in immigrant states. In Europe, we've seen the rise of xenophobic ideas. And in America, a lot of southern states, which take in a lot of most of the immigrants, the citizens there tend to be xenophobic as well. And this brings conversation to irredentalism. What is irredentalism? Irredentalism is the political idea that nations should merge if they are ethnically similar. And historically, we see that in Nazi Germany, and that was why there was a rise of international organizations as a response to irredentalism. Nazi Germany in the 1930s elected the National Socialistic Party in, and they began to expand. First, they annexed Austria, which is very much ethnically similar, with both nations mostly being made up of Germanic people. Then Hitler and his Nazi party moved to annex other nations, such as Czechoslovakia, where they took part of the state away. These is very ethnically rich in Germans. And finally, in the invasion of Poland, where he completely took over Poland, and which started World War II. Today, we see this in Russia, where Russia has taken Crimea. They've made pushes in the Caucasus with Georgia and Armenia and Azerbaijan, where they've seized territory as a response to impoverished Russian minorities. And they've also made pushes in Eastern Europe as well, Belarus and the Baltic states, where they've violated airspace, trying to assert their dominance, and complained about Russian minorities in those nations that are suffering. Another major international idea is the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain was a term coined by Prime Minister Winston Churchill in the United States when he was giving a speech to a local college, and said that the West needs to fear the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain are the satellite states of the Soviet Union, better known as the Warsaw Pact. This is made up of Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union. These nations cooperated as a response to Western ideas and Western international organizations such as NATO, and NATO formed in response to the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain had a major effect on European citizens. In the West, they feared nuclear war, they feared an invasion by the Soviets and the collapse of democracies in the West and their freedoms. In the East, they feared retaliation from their own government and from the West, as there was a clash of ideologies all across the world. Geopolitics, you can't ignore the conflicts and the nations of Israel and Palestine. In 1947, in response to the Holocaust, the UN set up the State of Israel as a safe haven for Jews. One day later, 4 Middle Eastern nations invaded Israel to claim the territory back for Palestine. Ever since that day, Israel has been in constant conflict to keep its borders, and its borders have constantly changed. We see how during the 6-Day War, Israel conquered the Sinai Peninsula near Egypt and the Golan Heights near Syria. And while they have relinquished the peninsula back to Egypt following the war, they've constantly recaptured the heights time and time again. Most recently during the Syrian conflict, a major political theory that can't be ignored in international politics is the domino theory. It was a theory that came from the Eisenhower administration that said that when one nation fell in a region to communism, the rest of the nations surrounding it would fall. And America has always acted in self-interest when this happens. This happened in Korea when North Korea invaded South Korea, diplomatic South Korea, and we responded with the UN help. We invaded the occupied South Korea and pushed the North Koreans all the way up to the Chinese border. The Chinese pulled over that border and pushed us back to the 48th parallel, where we've been since the 1950s. In Vietnam, the United States acted in response to help their ally, the diplomatic South Vietnam, and we fought a bloody conflict for 9 years that lasted in our withdrawal and the fall of South Vietnam to the communist North Vietnam. A federal government means that there's a de-evolution of power from the centralized government all the way down to local governments. We see that in the United States, where most of our laws that we have to follow come from a local or city government that goes on to the state, where they create more broad laws such as education and voting laws, all the way up to a national level where we have more broader topics such as how citizens interact internationally, how we interact between states within the United States, and how we vote, or how the military and the structure of our government works. There tends to be more power in local and state governments rather than a central national government in a federal system. And finally, we look at gerrymandering. Gerrymandering was a term made to comment on Governor Elbridge Gerry, who restructured the Massachusetts State Senate voting districts. This was a jab at his policies. He was very unpopular at the time, and his restructuring of the electoral districts affected the United States all across the country and even into today, where there's a lot of argument, should gerrymandering still be around? Gerrymandering can be good and bad. While it doesn't give a direct representation of the populace, because it does affect how voting is counted, it is diplomatic. It shows that with a transfer of power, people's voices can be heard through who they vote for, and more voting can be heard. We see how as the population tends to be more urban, there's a more liberal viewpoint in the government. And if voting districts were all based around cities, there'd constantly be a liberal government. But with gerrymandering, the rural states and rural areas have more of a say because they have more of their votes counting in national, state, and local voting and governments.